folks always say it's tough to soar with the eagles when you've been hooting with the owls. And last night's we gave you. What I'd like to do this morning is do a brief introduction of the Las Conchas fire, which will serve as the basis for the talks yet to come this morning on the different taxa in response to the fire, and then do a synthesis at the end. So the overall program together should provide a reasonably coherent beginning and ending with a lot of good meat in the middle here. For those of you, I guess Dustin, if you can kill the lights, please. For those of you who have, I'm Bob Parmenter from the Bias Caldera. I'm the chief scientist of the Caldera in charge of research, inventory, monitoring, and contributing to the science education programs there. Those of you that deal with fish and wildlife management and natural resources in general, if you're in this business for very long, one of the things you're certainly going to have to deal with is large-scale landscape fires, wildfires coming up, which will not only hit your fish and wildlife directly, but will alter the habitat for years to come. So here in the Valles Caldera in the Jemez Mountains, we had the Las Conchas fire in 2011, which at the time was the largest fire in the state history of New Mexico. It was quickly eclipsed the following year down in the Gila with the Whitewater Baldy fire. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Valles Caldera, it's the volcanic field in northern New Mexico, just a bit west of Santa Fe, and houses our national lab of Los Alamos on the flanks of it. It formed about 14 million years ago. The caldera we see today is about 1.25 million years old and is composed of a crater about 15 miles in diameter with a series of smaller mountains in the middle that have resulted from a number of eruptions over the last 1.25 million years. Land ownership around there is mostly public lands. The caldera is a national preserve under USDA and is surrounded by Bandelier National Monument to the southeast, Santa Clara up to the northeast, Los Alamos County, and 3 districts of the Santa Fe National Forest, so the Coyote, Espanola, and Jemez district. And in addition, there are a number of small communities on private inholdings in the area, including the little cluster of homes in Las Conchas, New Mexico. Habitats in this area are generally typical of montane systems in northern New Mexico, grasslands at the lower elevations, grading into ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, both xeric on south-facing slopes and mesic on north-facing slopes, ranging into spruce fir and aspen at higher elevations, and on particular south-facing slopes we get to a number of areas of montane scrub dominated by gamble oak and New Mexico locust. The habitat in this area, of course, has been hugely affected by human use in the 19th and 20th centuries in particular. This is a photograph of the Valle Grande of a sheep herd. Those of you familiar with the area could probably recognize Highway 4 right here when it was a dirt road. But the important thing in this photograph, there's 2 things here. Number one is look at the height of these grasses. The livestock, sheep in this case, have just grazed it down to the point that fine fuels can no longer carry fires. And then we've had active fire suppression during the 20th century to put fires out. The result is this understory of incredibly dense young ponderosa pines that are starting to come up. As a result, what it looks like today is we've infilled the old growth forest with high fuel loads of young trees. In addition, in the Valles Caldera and many places in the Jemez Mountains, during the 20th century there were extensive logging operations. Here's a series of aerial photographs of the Caldera Redondito Peak in 1963, post-logging in 1975, and the regrowth in 2005. You can see the jammer logging roads that were established to access the forest there. And it doesn't show really well because it's not quite dark enough in here, but the road systems all through these mountains are incredibly extensive. So it was a huge logging operation at the time. And the result was that because at the time in the private company, New Mexico Lumber and Timber, they didn't manage their slash, they didn't replant, they didn't recontour the landscape. So the forest that grew back was incredibly dense. We're looking at 800 to 2,000 trees per acre when the normal density ought to be about 40 to 60 trees per acre. Superimposed on the human impacts on this landscape is climate change. If we look at the temperature record from Jemez Springs, which is the south side of the Jemez Mountains where our headquarters is today, from 1914 to 2012, if you look at summer temperatures, July, mean monthly temperatures, it's coming up. Okay, climate is warming. We can even see it in little Jemez Springs. And the result is that we've warmed about 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century here. That, of course, has impacts on evapotranspiration from plants, as well as evaporation from soil. In addition, the precipitation dynamics in this place during the last century have also shown these massive oscillations that actually track the Pacific Decadal Oscillation with about a 50 to 60 year cycle. So in our particular case, we're looking at peak areas in the 1920s with a drought in the 1950s, back up to the really wet period in the 80s, and now we're down into the drought period again. We can probably anticipate another 10 years of below average precipitation on average until it comes back up again. But the disconcerting part of all this is that the peaks and the troughs are getting lower. N equals 2, we've got 2 cycles underway, but this peak is lower than this peak, and this trough is lower than that trough. So the overall trend is getting drier. Looking at 2011, this is one of the driest years we've had in the last century. So with that sort of scenario leading up to June 26, 2011, we have huge amounts of fuel on the ground and a warming, drying climate. The fuel moisture on June 26 for 1,000-hour fuels was about 6%. Just to give you an idea of that, comparison, the lumber that you buy in Home Depot or Lowe's has about 12% fuel moisture. So logs on the ground of dead materials was about half the moisture content as hardware store lumber. The 1-hour fuels, these are grasses, twigs, needles, and stuff, were below detection. They were so dry. In addition, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, according to our weather stations, we were looking at 80 degrees temperature, relative humidity of only 10%, and extremely windy conditions with gusts up to 42 miles an hour. The main character in the Las Conchas fire, the smoking gun, if you will, is an aspen tree that sprouted in 1917, after we did the tree ring analysis on it. Grew up, and during that process of its growth, ended up with heart rot and a damaged stump that a gust of wind on June 26 blew it over. Now, normally a tree falling in the forest is an unremarkable event. Starts to decompose and cycle its nutrients back in. But in this singular incident, there happened to have been, during the 20th century, a power line built nearby, and that tree, when it fell over, hit the power line. And unfortunately, the power line was strung with uninsulated wire. So when that hit that wire and started to spark, the Las Conchas fire was off and running. This was taken by a fisherman in the Valle Grande within a few minutes after it started. You can see from the angle the smoke how the wind is blowing it strongly from the west. 10 minutes later, as the fisherman's leaving, it had expanded quite a bit, and a few minutes after that, it was off and running, heading towards Bandelier in the southeastern part of the Jemez Mountains. This disaster shows the fire origin in Las Conchas, and in the first day, first 14 hours, it burned 43,000 acres. This gives you a rate of spread of 1 acre every 1.17 seconds. And to give you the kind of the mental image of that, that's burning a football field with both end zones and the bench areas every 2 seconds for 14 straight hours. So it was really fast moving. One of the fastest moving fires anybody had ever seen up there. Second day, it blew out to the north, and then in subsequent days, with southerly winds, it burned up into Santa Clara Canyon. And finally, about July the 4th, the fire line started to hold, and they started in-burning operations to contain it. And so by July 20th, that was pretty much the boundary, except for, again, some in-burning that they had to do to mop up. This gives you some idea of the height of the flames on the first day. This ridge line here has trees that you can see silhouetted here. Those are 100, 120 foot tall conifers. And the flames, the combustion gases, up on top here are several thousand feet in the air. The sun is way off to the left of this, so this isn't the sun peeking through here. It had horizontal rolling superheated gases and smoke that would take out entire canyons at a time. These systems basically would ignite trees that didn't have connecting fuels on them, so it was basically burning things to the ground, even though there weren't grasses and litter to take it from tree to tree. This is what it looked like from my house in Placitas that afternoon. I was doing a barbecue at the time. I thought, Monday's going to be a bad day. It was spotting quite readily in a lot of places along the fire front, so firefighters could not do a direct attack. They were trying to hold the lines on roads and highways. It, of course, went down within the first couple of days into Los Alamos, but those lines eventually all held. This is a shot from the International Space Station, what it looked like. This is obviously very early on in the fire, probably within 15 or 20 minutes after it started. Within a couple of days, we had over 1,000 firefighters on the ground. 3 Type 1 teams were set up around the perimeter. We had a small flotilla of aircraft, including slurry dumps and whatnot. So they really put a lot of money and effort into fighting this fire. Because things were so dry and so windy, the fire did not lie down at night. It kept going. Helicopter crews at night would record 300-foot tall flames coming off, and the pilot said they'd never seen anything like that in their career. So it kept burning fiercely through the night, and the next morning it jumped Highway 4, moved across Cerro Grande and Pajarito Mountain, and also across the Valle Grande into a place called Cerro del Medio. So it was burning up inside the preserve rather ferociously now. Plume-dominated fire behavior in the second, third, fourth days. High canopy destruction from the fire, as well as when the plume collapsed in the afternoon, it would push the fire across fire line. So the firefighters had a really hard time with it. The aftermath looked like this in Bandelier and down in the forest outside the preserve. So it was almost complete canopy replacement, stand replacement fires. And it burned over much of the areas that had been burned in previous fires here. If we look at the history of fire in the eastern flanks of the Jemez Mountains, you can see the fires that came on, the 1996 Dome Fire, Oso Complex, and then a bunch of little lightning strikes and things. And then finally Cerro Grande came along. So the eastern front had been hit pretty hard already, and then Las Conchas came and burned over all those areas as well. So it was really quite an impressive fire. Costs and losses, 63 homes, 49 outbuildings, cost $40 million. That price actually has risen to about $55 million now. Still incurring rehabilitation costs, particularly in Santa Clara Canyon. Minor injuries, fortunately, no deaths along the way. Some livestock, horses and whatnot were lost. Fences, infrastructure, communications. And then, of course, what we're talking about here today is the effect on natural resources, including fish and wildlife. These are some of the homes that were burned up. This is a cabin here. If we look, we got the same view here as here. Okay, so it was taken straight to the ground. 5 or 6 more houses here. You'll see that the diagnostic feature is that nothing combustible is left. It's nothing but metal, and masonry, and hot water tanks, and chimneys. So it really cleaned out a bunch of those areas. Fortunately, everybody got out okay. Livestock on the Valles Caldera were out there when the fire was occurring, and we were concerned about those, but fortunately, when they went through the pastures with livestock in it, it was backing into the wind, and the flame heights were about 3 inches tall. So the cows just stepped across there, the fire line, and were not injured. And so a bunch of us went out the next Saturday, a few days after the fire had passed through that part, and got on horses and ATVs and went out and rounded them up. What a fun day. I mean, there's a bunch of PhDs in here doing this. I'm taking the picture. Okay. Executive committee out in the preserve that day. Well, the fortunate thing that leads into this symposium today is that we had a really comprehensive ecosystem monitoring program for the preserve prior to the fire coming in. And that's always the problem with catastrophic events, is that the fires or earthquakes or whatnot is you don't have a lot of pre-data, pre-event data on all this. So here's our monitoring network. Most of this was in prior to the fire. Even things like weather stations that the fire burned underneath survived in good shape, recording the whole time. So we have very, very tight data on all of this. And this is almost like taking an experimental approach where you burn half of your sites, okay, after years and years of data collection. So some people were actually asking me, seriously, where was I on Sunday afternoon? This looks too good to be true. So the questions that came across after that managers wanted to know, scientists wanted to know, and whatnot, is what happens here. We know that the grassland comes back fast, but exactly what is going on here? What are the species doing? It looks pretty good, but did we lose species along the way? What about the insects, the pollinators, the predators? Were they wiped out? How fast will it take them to come back in? Same with the wildlife. Did elk get burned up? You know, those horizontal vortices rolling along canyon by canyon could be too quick for them to escape. So we want to know about those things. Big game, mountain lions, coyotes, bears. How did they survive? We know that some of the bears showed up in Los Alamos injured, and vets had to put them down. So we knew that some of the wildlife didn't get away. Certainly tree-dwelling species, birds in the forest, they couldn't have done very well. But in areas where you had a moderate burn, an understory burn, did they survive the heat and the smoke? Ground-dwelling species, they should have been in little miniature bomb shelters. Did they survive okay? Because once they come out, their habitat is completely changed. So there's questions all about this. Watersheds, watershed function with different burn severities, low to moderate to high severity, stand replacement fire. What about those in terms of the monsoons? We know that we had monsoon flooding coming down that quickly overcame valleys and flooded them out. The water quality changed quite a bit. The further downstream you get, the worse it gets. This is a video shot by Phoebe Suina, one of our students from UNM, that was out at Dixon Apple Orchard on this day when one of these floods came through. And the impressive thing about this, of course, is that not only is the water quality a little poor, but the impact of the accelerated and accumulated watersheds from above comes down and really has a lot of energy. These little trees that they're going through now are probably only 6 to 8 feet tall. They're young apple trees. But the interesting thing is she's going to pan around to the side here, and you'll see the size of the standing waves. So as we look here, there's a building that's going to come into view. It's a shed that probably has an eave of 12 to 15 feet tall. And the trees next to it, and the older growth, are probably about the same height, 12 to 15 feet. And she's going to zoom in on the waves down here next to those trees, and you'll see that the standing waves are almost as tall as those trees. So 12 feet, 13 feet tall waves, which is an amazing amount of energy coming down. Fortunately, the Valles Caldera didn't sustain scouring actions like this. Down at the confluence of the Rio Grande and Cochiti Canyon, it of course silted it in very badly. Rearranged islands in the Rio Grande, and of course had huge impacts downstream with dissolved oxygen and fish populations. So we have the Las Conchas fire. We know a lot about the fire itself, and we're following up on what the impact was on the natural resources. So today, we've got a number of speakers that will talk about the different topics, the different tags of interest. Matt Ziegler from New Mexico State University, Rebecca Ortel from the Valles Caldera, Jerry Jacoby from aquatic insects, Alicia Hodson also from the caldera, terrestrial invertebrates that form the food basis for a lot of these things. And bird communities, Dr. Aaron Greenlee from Hawks Aloft, and Jimmy Kane from New Mexico State University on the large mammals and small mammals of the Valles Caldera. And then at the end, I'll do a quick synthesis of what all these talks concluded, and then wind up with a forward-looking vision of what we're doing with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program in collaboration with the Forest Service and a wide number of NGOs in terms of how do we prevent the next Las Conchas fire before it happens. So thank you very much, and we will begin the festivities here with